Hi, everyone. Talking to you from Philadelphia today, where we are inundated by pollen. So hopefully you don't get too much of me clearing my throat throughout this presentation. As Justin said, I'm the Embodied Carbon Chair for ASHRAE Standard 240p. Do a quick, brief overview of what that is, why I'm here, talking about it, and what role you can play. So there are lots of ASHRAE standards that feature building decarbonization. This is a bunch of them. In particular, one that you might be hearing about a lot currently is 228, which is the method for evaluating zero net energy and zero net carbon building performance. And the question is like, so why does 240p matter a whole lot if we have all these other standards that are dealing with building decarb? Well, it's because they all deal with that carbon emissions happening during operations. There are some embodied carbon components that are included within them, but for the most part, they are looking just at the MEP systems and frequently just the mechanical systems. And for the most part, they're evaluating just the operational phase. So in particular, that 228 is looking just at building operations. At CLF, as you know, there's a huge bunch of other emissions associated with the buildings as well. So we need to start talking about those and evaluating those and thinking about those when we're thinking about our buildings and the way that they're being built. So our embodied carbon. So how do we focus on reducing operational carbon emissions without increasing the embodied carbon emissions proportionately so that we can reduce overall global carbon? That is the purpose of 240p. 240p is the quantification of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions in buildings. The scope is that we are providing minimum requirements for quantification of embodied and operational greenhouse gas emissions, aka carbon, associated with buildings and the documentation requirements of those emissions. This means we are including embodied carbon of materials and products, A1 through A5, B1, B4, and C1 through 4, fugitive emissions in B1, and operational emissions in B6. You'll notice there are some other life cycle modules that are being left out, especially for MEP. Those are not exactly negligible all the time, in particular when we talk about B2 and B3. So that's kind of your repair and your maintenance phases. But also remembering this is a minimum standard. And in fact, what we're doing is we're adding a bunch of modules that most people aren't accounting for yet. So other caveats to go with 240p and to maybe reduce some of the excitement. We are not creating benchmarks. We are not creating baselines. We are not setting rules for comparison between buildings. We also are not including on-site biogenic sequestration, landscape change, or infrastructure. And these are limitations in part because of the fact that this is being produced by ASHRAE, and ASHRAE typically has just looked at building systems. So the fact that we're even looking at the building as a whole and including all these materials that have nothing to do with engineering systems is a big deal and a big step for them. And also is a great way for us to start thinking about bringing these two bodies of people together who care a lot about emissions, the materials people and the building operations people. And that's essentially what we are trying to do. And in order to do that, we are developing it to be global. We are developing it to be code enforceable, meaning it can be adopted anywhere by anyone who is called an authority having jurisdiction, which can be anything from your local building code to the US GBC for any form of building standards, et cetera. And this specifically is being developed with the International Code Council, or the ICC. We also have had extensive consultation with people from the Science-Based Targets Initiative, RICS, and the EN standards committees that do these standards for whole building LCA. We've also talked a lot to the AIA, to the people in the ECHO project, to SCI 2050, USGBC, and MEP 2040. We've had them on committee calls and made sure to try and coordinate with all of the forthcoming documents from all of those different groups to the best extent possible. There are some places that we aren't fully harmonized, just so everybody knows. Intentionally, we are not fully harmonized with all of them, but where we deviated, it was very, very intentional. I was told you had a presentation on 240p a while ago, back when we released our first draft. So I am going to now just focus on what you should be expecting in terms of big changes from the update. And as I said before we officially started the call, the committee is getting together in April to be voting on the next public release draft. Assuming that it passes that vote, which I really, really hope it does, we will be putting out a public release draft this spring sometime in the second quarter. So with that, what are you going to notice as being hugely different? Well, first of all, you're going to notice there are a lot of places where we change like a word, and I'm not going to go through all those. What you will notice as bigger changes, especially in the embodied carbon section, include things like we are redefining the way that we talk about the system boundary for the material inventory. So in the first draft, we tried to list out everything that you should be including and draw the line at an appropriate place. We heard back from many people that our wording was really confusing. You weren't lying if you submitted one of those comments. It was very confusing. And also it led to the standard just being increasingly lengthy. And we found that actually, depending on what project it was being applied to, it might or might not actually capture the right scope. So instead, what we've done is we've added to that appendix that was at the end, before it was called informative appendix A, it is now normative appendix A. In standard language, what that means is it went from like, hey, here's a handy dandy reference to help you figure this stuff out, to this is now part of the requirements. And what we've done is we've taken an omni-class based table and said everything that is considered L3 is essentially where we're drawing a cutoff in terms of level of detail for categories of stuff. And then everything within that category must be accounted for up to about 95% of it. So you can exclude up to 5% of each L3 omni-class category. For example, if you're in the electrical subcategory, which is at L3, you might choose to exclude all of your wiring because your project team has determined that it makes up less than 5% of that subcategory's mass, right? So if you have some really big circuit boards and panel boards and switchboards, and anyway, you can tell I now work in the electrical sector. Transformers, all kinds of really big equipment. Your wiring might be less than 5% by mass, and you've chosen to exclude it because the calculation of it's really onerous, and honestly, it's not contributing that much to that category. That's an option. Similarly, in terms of plumbing, again, you're allowed to cut off up to 5% by cost or by mass. So whichever way you're using to account for your building, you can have up to 5%. Yes, I know all of my LCA nerds in the audience are groaning because why are we allowing cost to be used instead of always making it required by mass? This is because of the code enforceable part. It's expected that frequently your authority having jurisdiction, the random code official who has been assigned to look over this is going to be used to looking over costing data. They're probably not used to figuring out how much a building weighs. So being able to evaluate based off cost was something that needed to be contained. Again, we are in a place with 240p of defining the minimum standard. You can always advocate in your particular location that they make it stricter or that they remove certain parts of the language. What else is new? Well, there's a real big change for everyone in LCA, which is you're going to have to do uncertainty calculations. So this is uncertainty made up of evaluation of essentially two big things. One is how much is your material quantity calculation correct? These are set percentages based off of your project phase. So this is something that we received a lot of comments on, that the quantities seem too low, that it would be really onerous on project teams to be able to figure out what this percentage is, yada, yada, yada. We have aligned to the approach that is taken by the RIC standard for a whole building lifecycle assessment, which is that we are just giving you a percentage to apply based off of what documentation you're using. So construction documentation has a set percentage. Anything earlier than construction documentation has a set percentage. Anything that's an as-built or using like actual material data from on-site during construction has a set percentage. So that's it. You're just going to take that percentage. No further calculation required. But we're going to make you do a whole lot of calculations based off of your data selection. And the intent for that is that we recognize that as LCA practitioners, Sometimes the best data that's the most representative just doesn't exist. So we need to create flexibility for people to be able to use the appropriate proxy data. On the other hand, there's a lot of ways to game the system by using proxy data in order to try and get your building to look better than it would otherwise. So essentially what we're doing is requiring a score to be calculated based off of how representative your data is. And then that percentage gets multiplied against your total calculated embodied emissions. So you get a kilogram carbon value, and you have to add it to the top of your building's emissions calculated value. So essentially, if it's big because you use bad data, your building will look like it's performing worse than if you were using better data. So it's a motivator to use the best, most representative data you can get your hands on. It's also a way of keeping everyone putting the pressure on the manufacturers to supply the data necessary for all of their products. Because it's a great competitive advantage if you're the one with the best LCA data for everyone to be able to use, and they have to be able to meet code requirements based off of a certain threshold. Your product will score better. So, for my big nerds out there, what's the controversial stuff? Well, one is that whole you have to add your uncertainty on top thing. Second, we heard you about carbonation of concrete. It can happen at any point in the life cycle. And yes, you should account for it in the stage of the life cycle when it occurs. Biogenic carbon, it is in the standard. Yes, we are really trying to avoid having to define what is meant by sustainability harvested. For everyone who has talked about biogenic carbon at any point in time, this is a very thorny issue. We have done our best to thread the needle on this one. We didn't feel like we were the right body to redefine what sustainable forestry means globally. We're a bunch of, MEP engineers and building LCA people, not foresters or wood people for the most part. And so we tried our best to align to existing standards and to thread the needle on picking. We didn't want to just like pick a winner out of the current debates going on in the wood space. So we tried to align, but also place some restrictions on the more generous interpretations of what sustainable forestry can mean. So that it's actually still a meaningful term. Also, no, we're not going to just add land use change impacts for what's happening on site. Sorry for everyone who submitted that comment. Soil sequestration potential on site. While as an environmentalist, I recognize that that is a thing that can happen. There are practices you can use to better sequester carbon on your site using soil practices. We are not going to give you a methodology for calculating that, at least not in this version, not until there's a fully finalized public version. And then if you really want that, please volunteer to join the committee on continuous maintenance. Okay, item number 3, dynamic LCA. It is super cool. I agree. We're not going to try and add that for what is supposed to be a minimum standard. For everyone who doesn't know about dynamic LCA, essentially this is saying the grid is decarbonizing. Our products are made with energy that comes from the grid. We should be able to project forward how much embodied carbon will be in products in the future and not assume that they will have the same impacts that they have now. It's really cool stuff. It's very innovative. There were some really cool studies that got sent to us that have been published. This is really advanced, and we are not going to ask for a minimum standard of people just trying to submit to meet code that they do that form of calculation at this point in time. We thought asking them to do uncertainty calculations was probably onerous enough. All right, and then finally, yes, uncertainty. We are making you do it and report the value of the data you are selecting to use. If you are going through and selecting data, you should be doing so knowledgeably, and you should understand how applicable it is to your project and not just be selecting blindly. So yes, we are asking you to do that. Yes, we know the tools currently do not allow for that, but also your tools should update to meet the standards that apply. So I'm sure they are all tracking this very closely. I know when Tally was still something that I was involved in, we were tracking every draft of every standard that was coming out specifically so we can make sure that we could implement all the changes necessary to meet those standards. All right, short term, what can you do as a random person who exists in the space and cares about this topic? When the public release draft comes out, again, hopefully it's going to be sometime this quarter of the year, between now and June. Review it. One of the most important things with ASHRAE that you need to keep in mind is when you review and put comments on ASHRAE drafts, you need to include proposed language, not just thoughts on why you think what is there is wrong. The committee is allowed to automatically reject any comments that do not include proposed language. I didn't do that as the committee chair this time around because lots of very smart people gave us really smart comments that did not include proposed language. In the next round, I'm not going to be able to waive that requirement again. So please, 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 if you are commenting, make sure you're putting language that you would like to see in its place in that box. Wherever possible, when you're giving us, hey, you should change this number, or make this number bigger, make this number smaller, use this method instead. Please reference papers that it comes from, provide citations whenever and wherever possible. It makes a huge difference. We on the committee are made up of experts for sure, but we are experts in completely different areas. So when I am trying to explain to an energy modeler why for LCA, this is the practice that I think should be followed, or why I think that this practice is better than that practice, when 3 different commenters have submitted different things, it is super helpful to have those references to be able to help reinforce why one comment or suggestion is better than another. And then finally, if you really care about this and you want to get really deep into it, you can attend our meetings. They are public, they are open. ASHRAE has Zoom links to basically all of them, and you can attend. You're not allowed to vote, but you're allowed to attend and also make comments and participate in the conversation if you would like to. In terms of what happens next after that, hopefully before the end of 2025, we have a finalized version, first version of this that is ready to go and to be published. This is one of the standards that ASHRAE has identified is going immediately into what's called continuous maintenance, meaning immediately after publishing it, they're going to go into revisions again. When that happens, they will be soliciting for new members of the committee. I'm sure they're actually, I don't know for sure, but generally there are some people who are willing to roll over and stay on the committee, but there will also be spaces for new people to join. So especially in the embodied carbon space, we need people who know this. And in particular, if you know energy modeling or operational carbon modeling and LCA, there aren't enough of us going around, and we act as the translators for the whole committee. So please volunteer your expertise. We can definitely use it. Discuss all of your updated needs and concerns with your tool providers. If you're using One-Click LCA, if you're using Tally, make sure that they know. I mean, again, I'm sure they're tracking it, but let them know what concerns you may or may not have. And then finally, Justin mentioned advocacy in the beginning of this, but ASHRAE puts out standards. They don't make them get adopted. They can't force every building code everywhere to include them as the reference standard. They can't force the USGBC to include them as a reference standard. We certainly will try, but advocacy from users of standards, from knowledgeable practitioners, letting the people who are writing the codes and making the laws know that they should be referencing the standard, either in part or in full. So that's the other thing with ASHRAE standards is you don't have to take the whole thing. We had a lot of comments that were concerned about the scope that we were requiring. Since we are requiring MEP, we are requiring your fire suppression systems to be included. This is something where, again, knowledgeable practitioners should be providing advice and guidance to the people writing the code. So please let them know that you either think they should adopt it in full, that you think everyone's capable of doing so in your jurisdiction, or say, we think you should adopt this, but for this round, leave X, Y, and Z out. Again, we had to write a standard that we thought everyone would be able to follow, but also trying to keep things moving forward at the pace they need to. So knowing the cycle of when this stuff gets published, it's probably going to be a couple of years before there's a new version. And we wanted to make sure that the version that we put out there could cover the reality of data availability, et cetera, for the next few years. So if you're curious about me and what I do, there's a slide about, I think that links to our research homepage for Schneider. I haven't tested it recently and they did update the slide, but I think that's the right place for all the white papers and stuff that we do. And finally, this is the back of my business card. So if you want to look me up, I'm with Schneider Electric now, and always happy to have conversations or take questions.